Now, and we're recording the duende, which is, I will go on to say, in the instruction of young warriors, this focuses upon the wily and cunning tricks played by a character called Coyote. And some social anthropologists have ascribed the brilliant warfare stratagems of that 19th century Apache war chief, Geronimo, as the practical embodiment of these lessons, which he implemented in deceiving and eluding the very best West Point trained officers of the United States Army, who commanded troops outnumbering this savage raider by tenfold or more. You know, it was amazing that Geronimo was able to wreak havoc with so few people in his war bands. And the movements of the United States Army had no such understanding of the coyote principles, or the principles of duende being involved in being, well, implemented on the field of battle. By the way, I always like to make a note that the greatest warriors in the Native American nations were supposedly the Cherokee, who actually gave over command of their troops often to women who became field marshals in combat. And isn't it amazing that the president of the Cherokee Nation, until very recently, had the surname of Mankiller, Mary Mankiller, or Chain Mankiller, it doesn't matter. I used to go out with a girl who was Native American, and her last name was Gutspiller, because her family used to render the buffaloes after they'd been killed, and their family used to rip open the belly. Oh, that's another whole story. And anyway, in the sparse fragments preserved from 8th century Anglo-Saxon writing, transcribed from oral formulaic verse, located especially in the Beowulf saga, there are references to magical creatures described as eotenish, that is, elfin or gnomic, elves or gnomes, in the substantive grammatical case, Aotans. And by the way, on my little car, the smart car I have, is the license plate Aotan, which means elf or gnome. And although J.R.R. Tolkien attempted to trace their origin in his seminal essay, Beowulf, the Beasts and the Critics, he was unable to exactly identify these beings, as did a scholar later, who determined earlier in his 1911 doctoral dissertation, that these creatures most likely were biblical, that is, presuming the author of Beowulf had any early Christian influences, and to have been the progeny of Lilith. That was Adam's first wife, expelled from paradise for her refusal to be dominated by first man. Lilith, who thrived east of Eden in the land of Nod, where Cain was exiled, as well as all of the others that were there. They survived the great flood, and they weren't being allowed passage onto Noah's Ark for sure, and yet they had evolved into amphibian creatures, presumably with gills or some other survival evolutionary freak adaptation, but were on the order of monsters. When these phenomenal survivalists were encountered in Beowulf, they were also discovered to be the artisans of weaponry that could penetrate any known armor, and their own bodies were proof against any contemporary cutting or piercing implements. Excalibur, of the early English hero Arturus Rex, King Arthur, he possessed this sort of magic, and it was one of the eotenish lethal weapons which Beowulf stumbled across and picked up from the floor of Grendel's mother's murky grotto. Both she and her spawn were definitively Eotans, with which he was able thereby to murder her. These superior alloyed items of warrior cutlery were much like our tempered steel of modern times. In Greek mythology, such superior metal was fashioned by the Cyclopean inhabitants of caves, where the mining of the ferrous ore was smelted into alloys forged into superior tools of warfare, forged steel, which became the formidable sidearms of later conquering warriors. Therefore, it would seem that these mythical Cyclops characters were actually those beings who appeared to be one-eyed, looking monocular, because they wore miner's lamps strapped to their foreheads. Well, that's mythography. That was what Robert Graves first taught me about. Actually, he gave me that example himself about the Cyclopes, about the Cyclopean people, the people who were smelting metal back in the caves. And when they were seen, they seemed to have one eye. Well, that was their miner's lantern on their foreheads. Well, that's so much for the very beginning of the book of the duende, and I'm going to play then some music that will be of a more salubrious nature. And that's a little bit of that, classical guitar music. And now we're getting to the classical part of this program, which is still on KUHS LP 102.5 FM. And I'm going to read you the very beginning of the duende book that I wrote. I know this sounds strange, but I spent many, many years writing this book. And it came to be the shortest book I've ever written. I'm editing another book right now. I'm a writer. I don't know how many writers you know. But this other book has taken me the better part of 8 years to write the first draft. And now I'm doing the editing, which is probably going to be maybe a year and a half. But it's this book, The Duende. I began working on the ideas and making notes about it a long, long time ago. And only in the past couple of years was it finally published in 2015. It is available at the Garland Library. I gave 2 copies to them, and I think they paid me money for them as well. I'm going to read to you the first example of peak experience, as experienced in, of all places, a death camp, a concentration camp. And that term was first used in the Boer War at the turn of the century down in South Africa, with the Afrikaans forces against the British forces, fighting over who had the right to enforce apartheid and take the diamonds and the gold and all the riches from African people. And Nelson Mandela finally was able to end all of that and become the president of the African nations. But by the way, he had his own peak experiences in prison and came out a transformed man. But this is about a death camp called Auschwitz. The sense of peak experience, or the quintessential height of excitation, however, for the individual emotional state described as duende, can be related to extreme points of awareness felt in life in threatening danger, or deep valence, sensual experiences of pleasure. In his memoirs of survival from internment at the Second World War death camp Auschwitz, entitled Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor E. Frankl tells of focusing his mind on the image of his beloved wife, whom he discovered only after his liberation and release from this concentration camp, that she had been sent to the gas chambers and then incinerated in the crematorium on the very day they both arrived, several years before, which he had believed had maintained his spirit of hope and will to survive. He compares this sacred image to a light he calls lux tenebris, which he also was able to then perceive an actual luminescence issuing from a distant farmhouse on a hillside horizon of that bleak, miserable gray